Now, what is going on in Syria? Now, I urge you to log onto our website and download our booklet, Syria in Prophecy, and we will show you that this whole civil war that happened in Syria was prophesied in the Bible. But then there is a separate prophecy about Damascus. And Damascus is a separate situation, but it shows that Damascus is weak and feeble, and the reason why it's weak and feeble is because of the civil war that's been going on. Syria is pretty much destroyed, and all that's left pretty much is Damascus, and we got Iran there in Damascus helping out the Syrian government, which is also prophesied in the Bible in Zechariah, the 9th chapter, verse 1. Zechariah 9, verse 1, it says, the burden of the word of the eternal in the land of Hadrach. Now, we show you in that booklet, Syrian Prophecy, that means Iran, and Damascus shall be the rest thereof. And that means the rest thereof, meaning the wrath of God is resting on Damascus. And then it says, when the eyes of man and as of all the tribes of Israel shall be towards the Lord. So here he is. Here, the time setting of this prophecy, of course, is in the end time. So here we see the wrath of God is resting on Iran and Damascus. And now we're starting to see trouble in Damascus. We're seeing the United States striking in eastern Syria, but there's also problems in western Syria with the Jews, and of course the greatest ally the Jews have, of course, is the United States of America. So things are starting to really ramp up in this area. Now, when we go to Isaiah, the 17th chapter, actually, let's go to Jeremiah, the 49th chapter, and here it's concerning Damascus, verse 23, and it says, Hamath is confounded, Aphad and Arphad, for they have heard evil tidings. These are the evil tidings out of the east and out of the north, which is Iran, and also old Persia and Media, which is where ISIS was. And because of ISIS, there was a civil war in Syria and pretty much destroyed the whole nation, but not Damascus. So these are the evil tidings. And it says they are faint-hearted. And then it says there is also trouble. It says sorrow, but it should read trouble on the sea, and it cannot be quiet. Now, who is troubled on the sea? That's the western part of Syria in the Mediterranean. Who is stationed in the Mediterranean, and who is troubled, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I read it to you in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45. Who is troubled? The king of the north, NATO. And who is stationed in the Mediterranean? NATO, Turkey, Greece. We got the British in Cyprus. It is NATO that is troubled on the sea. They are troubled and they cannot be quiet. Notice, they cannot be quiet. Then it says, Damascus is waxed feeble and turned herself to flee, and fear hath seized on her, anguish and sorrow hath taken her as a woman in travail. That's the civil war that's been going on in Syria. Damascus is waxed feeble because the whole nation is pretty much collapsed, and Damascus is the only thing that's running right now. It says, how is the city of my praise not left, the city of my joy? It used to be a Christian city. The early New Testament church was pretty much stationed in Damascus and Antioch and other places. Then it says in verse 36, therefore her young men shall fall in her streets, and all the men of war shall be cut off in that day. That's always an indication of the end time of God's wrath, says the Eternal of hosts. Notice, and I, that's God, will kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus, and it shall consume the places of Ben-Hadad. So notice that prophecy. God says, I will do it. And of course, when God brings about his wrath, he brings it about through his people, Israel. And here we see the United States striking in Syria. Now, is it going to escalate? Is it going to escalate to the point where the United States is going to attack Damascus? Well, Bible prophecy says so. God says, I I will kindle a fire in the wall of Damascus, and it shall consume the palaces thereof. And in the Moffat translation, it puts it this way: I will fling fires of war upon Damascus, and the walls. I will fling fires of war upon Damascus's walls and burn up all Ben-Hadad's palaces. Now, what flings through the air and burns down buildings? Missiles. And God says that he's going to fling fires of war against the wall of Damascus, and it's all going to burn down. And God does this by his people, Israel, as I just read to you in Jeremiah, the 51st chapter, verse 19 through 23. And now let's go to Isaiah, the 17th chapter. Here is another prophecy about Damascus. This is an interesting prophecy because it links the fall of Damascus with the fall of NATO. So here they are linked together. So obviously Israel is involved with Damascus, and God uses Israel to break kingdoms apart. It says here, the burden of Damascus, verse 1 of Isaiah, the 17th chapter. The burden of Damascus, behold, Damascus is taken away, and from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. It's going to be a ruinous heap. By what? Well, by the missiles that the United States and the NATO forces are going to fling at Damascus to destroy it. And why are they going to destroy it? Because of Iranian proxies. It says that Damascus and Iran, in Zechariah, the 9th chapter, God's wrath is going to rest on them. So because of Iran, their proxies and so on, it shall be a ruinous heap. And then it says these cities shall be forsaken and their flocks and so on in verse 2. And God talked about breaking in pieces the flocks thereof through Israel in Jeremiah 51 that I just read to you. Now notice this. Here's an interesting prophecy. Let me just get my notes here before I go any further. Here we go. It says this in verse 3. The fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria, they shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, says the Eternal of hosts. And then it says, verse 4, and in that day, that's the end time, it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh made wax lean. Now notice what it says here from the Strongs. That word fortification means figuratively a defender, and that's NATO's role, was to defend Europe from communism, the defender. And then Gill says that this may be understood not of that particular city and fortress only, but of all their strongholds. The singular being, but for the plural. So it's not speaking of just Ephraim, but all of Ephraim's strongholds, the whole alliance, the whole NATO alliance is going to fall when Damascus falls. So when we see Damascus fall, we're going to see the occupation of Judah by the NATO allies at that time when Damascus falls is pretty much all going to happen nearly the same time. Damascus is going to fall. Then we're going to see NATO fall, NATO break apart, ladies and gentlemen. That will fulfill the prophecy of Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45. This is the most pivotal prophecy right now in our time, when he plants the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and in the glorious holy mountain. He shall come to his end, and none shall help him. The end of NATO, the end of the United States and Britain being world powers, and after this becomes the scattering of the power of the holy people that you read of in Daniel, the 12th chapter, verse 7. As it says, I heard a man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, and he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven. He swore by him that lives forever. And then he talks about the times, and half a time, or they call the Great Tribulation. And then it says, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Now, when you look at the Hebrew, it means that the scattering comes first, then comes the Great Tribulation. We also read that in Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, where God says that he takes his power away. When the power is taken away, then comes his judgment on Israel. So what we're going to see when NATO breaks apart, we're going to see Damascus is going to be destroyed by the NATO allies. Then we're going to see NATO come apart. The EU is going to come apart. Then we're going to see the scattering of the power of the holy people, the scattering of the power of the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, the peoples of Northwestern Europe. We're going to see breakups, the Civil War. We're going to see a civil war in the United States, civil war in Canada, breakups of provinces, breakups of states. The power is going to be gone, ladies and gentlemen. Then comes the Great Tribulation.